Okay, so Oskar Schindler. Everybody knows the name, right? The story's incredible. Like, a German businessman starts out a war profiteer, and then bam, he transforms into this savior. Rescues more than 1,000 Jews from the Holocaust. Talk about a powerful change. And you give me some seriously fascinating stuff to look at for this, to figure out just how that transformation even happened. Like, what were the specific things that pushed him to become a hero? Let's try and figure it out.
Absolutely. So for this deep dive, we are going right to the source. Thomas Keneally's Schindler's Ark. This book's amazing, A novel based on the true accounts of the that's what they call themselves, Schindler's Jewish workers and other people who actually saw what happened. It's pretty powerful stuff. So what we're doing today, our mission, is to track how Oskar Schindler changed. From this German entrepreneur, a guy with big ambitions, to the man who, against insane odds, saved more Jewish lives during World War II than anyone else. We'll be looking at what he did, why he did it, and the whole crazy historical situation that shaped him into a hero.
And for you, dear listener, who wants to understand these really complicated historical things, but, without all the boring parts, this is going to be right up your alley. We don't want to just slap labels on people. Good guy, bad guy. That's too simple. We want to find those little surprises, those aha moments in the history books that show us how Schindler made the choices he did.
All right, so let's rewind the clock a bit. Before the war even started, who was Oskar Schindler? What was he trying to achieve?
Well, based on the book, he was a businessman through and through, German, obviously, super ambitious, always going after success. The book even mentions how he really wanted to impress his dad, who he wasn't very close to.
Makes you wonder if that drive to prove himself played a role later on.
Yeah, maybe. It's interesting, though, because even though he had ties to Henlein early on, that's the guy who led the Sudeten-German party, they were pro-Nazi, big in Czechoslovakia before the war. Even with those connections, there are signs that Schindler wasn't fully on board with the whole National Socialism thing. He was supposedly really bothered by how they were treating the Czechs, bullying them and stealing their property. And this was before the war officially kicked off.
That's a good point. Even early on, even with his ambition, there were signs he had some kind of moral compass. Maybe it wasn't super strong at first, but it was there. And it kind of makes his later actions make more sense. It wasn't a complete 180, more like he was leaning into something that was already there. Yeah. And we can't forget, he was a really sharp businessman. He knew how to make connections, how to work the system.
Absolutely. He was great at sales before the war, and that definitely helped him set up the Deutsche E-Mail-Waren Fabrik. It was called DEF, but the Poles and the Jews just called it Emalia. It was his factory in Krakow. He was good at getting things going.
And pretty soon, word got around about that factory, especially among the Jewish community in Krakow. What were those early interactions with them like?
Well, he connected with Jewish businessmen pretty early on, like Abraham Bankier. He actually helped Schindler get the money he needed to start Emalia. And it's worth noting that from pretty much the beginning, Emalia had this little reputation as a safe place. He hired more and more Jewish workers, and there are even stories about him helping specific people. Like, there's Leopold Pfefferberg. Schindler apparently helped him out with his apartment and introduced him to some business contacts.
That early period's really interesting, isn't it? It kind of shows that even before the Holocaust was in full swing, Schindler was already treating the Jewish community differently. Not just his business deals. It hints that maybe he had some empathy for them, or at least understood that having them on his side was good for business. But then things got really bad in Krakow. They set up the ghetto, and the Einsatzgruppen arrived.
Oh, man, that's right. The book really paints a vivid picture of what it was like when they created the Krakow ghetto and the Einsatzgruppen started doing their thing. These guys were brutal, mobile killing squads, they called them. They were a huge part of how the Holocaust got started. Their job was basically to get rid of anyone the Nazis saw as an enemy, mainly Jews, Roma people, Soviet officials. And they weren't exactly taking prisoners, they were just killing people on the spot, often in really horrible ways. When you understand what those guys were doing, you realize just how much danger the Jewish population was in. Raids on apartments, synagogues being destroyed. It was a time of pure terror.
Yeah, absolutely terrifying. And in all of that, there's this one moment with Schindler and Itzhak Stern that really sticks out.
Right. Totally. Before they did those horrible things in Kazimierz in December 1939, Schindler supposedly warned Itzhak Stern. Just imagine that, knowing what was coming and trying to warn someone. It changes how you see Schindler. He wasn't just some businessman ignoring what was happening. He knew things were bad and was willing to risk something to help. Maybe he understood just how much danger the Jewish population was in, even then.
Right, that warning tells you something about him. He wasn't just watching from the sidelines. And then there's that moment when he talks to his new Jewish workers at Amalia. What was it he promised them exactly?
He basically told them that if they worked for him, they'd be safe, they'd survive. The book actually calls it a godlike promise. And when you think about the situation they were in, surrounded by all that horror, you can see why a promise like that would have given them some hope.
Yeah, it's like a glimmer of light in all that darkness. And it seems like Amalia actually was different from other factories around there. What were the conditions like for the Jewish workers?
From what the workers themselves said, it was way better than other places. They felt safer and the conditions were better. It wasn't like those other horrible forced labor camps. And the book also talks about how Schindler kept trying to expand the factory so he could hire even more Jewish people. He even went out of his way to get jobs for people who were really vulnerable, like orphans. He was actively trying to protect them.
That's a huge step in his transformation, right? He wasn't just helping out on the side anymore. He was actually doing something to save them. And inside Amalia, he started building some important relationships too, didn't he?
Oh, yeah, for sure. His relationship with Itzhak Stern is a big part of the story. Stern wasn't just another worker. He became like Schindler's right-hand man, his advisor, almost like a moral compass, you know. They'd have these deep conversations about philosophy and stuff, and it's clear that Stern had a big influence on him. You also see Schindler doing things that might seem small, like little acts of rebellion, but they were actually helping his workers. Like, he'd use his connections to get them black market bread through people like Madrish.
It's like he was constantly testing the limits, seeing what he could get away with. Those little acts of rebellion show how willing he was to bend the rules, to put himself at risk, to take care of his people. And it seems like his understanding of how bad the Holocaust actually was growing too.
Definitely. There's a part in the book where he sees the cattle cars, you know, those trains they were using to transport people. It's a really powerful image, and it must have made him realize just how awful the Nazi atrocities were.
It's one thing to hear about it, another to see it firsthand. That must have been a real turning point for him. And then the Nazi persecution got even worse. They liquidated the Krakow ghetto, and they set up the Plazow forced labor camp, run by that monster among Goeth. How did Schindler react to that?
This is where you really start to see how he became a hero. The book doesn't shy away from how brutal Plastow was under Goeth. The guy was a sadist, plain and simple. And what Schindler did was he actively tried to protect his workers by getting them moved to a subcamp within the Amalia factory grounds. This wasn't some simple request, you know. He had to negotiate with Goeth himself, which was incredibly risky. He had to use every connection he had, and there are strong hints that he even bribed Goeth. Like, remember that part about the kitchenware with Bosch?
Negotiating with Goeth, that must have been terrifying.
Yeah.
The guy was unpredictable and violent. Schindler was basically playing with fire.
Yeah.
And this is also when you start to see more of his empathy coming through, don't you think?
Oh, yeah, definitely. There's that part where he comforts Helen Hirsch. She was Goeth's maid, and her situation was just awful. He acknowledges how bad things are for her. It shows that he saw her as a human being, you know, someone who deserved compassion in the midst of all that cruelty.
So he's got this subcamp at Amalia now. But running that must have been its own challenge, right? How did he manage to keep his workers relatively safe and give them decent conditions into the Nazis' noses?
It was a constant balancing act, and it was super risky. He had the SS breathing down his neck all the time, and his workers were always in danger. But he used his own money, his connections, and I think he was just really persuasive to make sure they had better food and better conditions at Amalia than they would have had at Plazow. And there are stories about him stepping in to stop his workers from being sent to Plazow or other camps. He'd use his influence, tell the Nazis they were vital to the war effort. There's a really tense part where he stops them from being loaded onto a train.
Those moments where he puts himself on the line, that's real bravery, right? He was working the system, putting himself in danger, all to protect them. And that leads us to the most famous part of his story, the part that really cemented him as a hero, Schindler's List. What happened that made him decide to create that list?
It all comes down to the end of the war. They liquidated Plazow, and it was pretty clear that the Nazis were losing. Schindler realized his workers were about to be sent to extermination camps. He had to do something drastic, and that's what made him create the list. It was a list of his workers, all the people he claimed were essential for this new factory he was supposedly setting up in Czechoslovakia.
And making that list, deciding who to include, that couldn't have been easy. What were his reasons for choosing certain people?
Well, the book makes it seem like Itzhak Stern was really involved in that process. And I think there were a lot of factors. It wasn't just about who had the right skills. There were personal connections for sure, and probably a sense of who was most vulnerable, who needed help the most. And you can't forget the sheer amount of money and effort Schindler put into basically buying his workers from the Nazis. He was risking everything to save them.
Buying people to save them from being murdered. That's about as heroic as it gets, I think. And even after he made the list, getting those people to safety wasn't a sure thing, was it?
No way. Getting to that new factory in Brinlitz was dangerous, especially for the women. They got sent to Auschwitz-Birkenau by mistake, can you imagine? It was terrifying for them. And Schindler had to pull out all the stops to get them back. He used every bit of influence he had. We also shouldn't forget about Emily Schindler. She did so much to help the workers during that time. She gave them food, comfort, whatever they needed. She was incredibly brave and compassionate.
It's true, people don't always remember her part in all this, but she was essential. So they finally make it to Brinlitz, and even then, Schindler never stopped protecting his workers. He kept it up until the war was over.
Yeah, Brinlitz was better than the other places, and Schindler made sure they had enough food and that no one would hurt them. There's even that part in the book about his birthday where he gives a speech and promises to stay with them until the very end. It's really powerful, shows how much he cared about them.
So, taking everything we've learned into account, how do we explain how Schindler became a hero? What pushed him to go from businessman to savior?
It's a process, you know? A gradual thing. You start with this ambitious businessman who's out for himself. Then he starts seeing what's really going on, the horrors of the Holocaust, and it changes him. He starts actively protecting his Jewish workers at Amalia, and then there's the list, this huge act of selflessness. And then he just never gives up on them. He stays with them until the very end. It wasn't one specific thing that made him a hero. It was a whole journey shaped by the terrible things happening around him and, it seems, by a change of heart.
The book jacket says it's about the growth of the human soul, and I think that really fits. We can't know exactly what was going on in Schindler's head, you know?
Yeah.
Did he start out disgusted by what the Nazis were doing and then develop real empathy? Or was it a mix of things, like wanting to save himself, using the situation to his advantage, but also realizing he had a responsibility to do the right thing? It's complicated, but the result is clear. He risked everything to save over 1,000 people. It's like maybe he started out valuing money and things, but then he realized that human life was what really mattered.
So for our listeners who are trying to understand how this guy, Oskar Schindler, became a hero, what are the key things to take away from his story?
Well, first of all, becoming a hero isn't a light switch. It's a journey. Schindler's transformation happened over time. It wasn't instant. He went from looking out for himself to putting his life on the line for others. And secondly, seeing the horrors of the Holocaust firsthand really changed him. It made him act. Thirdly, everything he did to protect his Jewish workers at Amalia, especially creating that list, those were incredibly brave and selfless acts. And lastly, he never abandoned his workers. He stayed with them until the war ended, no matter the risk. That shows how deeply he changed. He wasn't just doing a good deed, he was committed to saving them. His heroism wasn't a one-time thing, it was something he kept doing, even when it was dangerous. He changed because he saw what was happening around him, and because his conscience wouldn't let him stand by and do nothing.
And what are some of the questions that Schindler's story raises, things people might want to think about after listening to this deep dive?
I think it makes you wonder about the things people are capable of, good and bad. Like, how can people be so cruel? But then you have someone like Schindler who risks everything to save others. How does being in a horrible situation like that change how you make moral choices? And what does being a hero really mean? It's not always obvious. It challenges us to look beyond simple ideas of good and evil. People's motivations are complicated, especially in a crisis.
If any of this has got you thinking and you want to learn more, I really recommend checking out some other resources about the Holocaust. Read about other people who rescued people during that time and look into how people made moral decisions during such a dark period in history. Learning more about Oskar and Emily Schindler and reading the first-hand accounts of the Schindler-Juden, those would be really powerful too.
At the end of the day, Oskar Schindler's story reminds us that even in the darkest times, even when things seem hopeless, one person can make a difference. Choosing to act with humanity, even if it's not perfect, even if it's late, can have a huge impact. Schindler didn't just save lives, he showed that good can still exist, even when surrounded by evil. That's a powerful message, I think.